Today, we're going to be talking about Biosocial Approaches to Childrearing, which is a course that Dr. Emily Emmett here has held twice now and will be continuing on next year. So the first question that I want to ask you is whether you could possibly give us a quick introduction to the module.
Sure. So my course is about developing a holistic understanding to the determinants and consequences of child rearing practices in different contexts. So in my course, we cover things like core concepts like what exactly is development, because how you perceive development might impact how you engage with children and adolescents and how you look after them. We also cover key theoretical concepts from different disciplines. And the main thing is what we do is we critically examine how people care for children across different cultural contexts, what kind of impact that might have on children's development, as well as the caregivers. So I really try to get this kind of holistic overview of how humans look after children in different places, different cultures, what's similar, what's different, and so on.
All right. And to do this, we've discussed different biosocial frameworks. Which one do you think can best help us understand child development and why?
So when we say biosocial, I think people have different meanings of the word biosocial, and I come at it from quite a broad angle, I guess. So anything that kind of overlaps biology and social sciences, I kind of grab them and try to shove it in the course in a way. The really important thing to keep in mind, I think, with this biosocial approach, which we try to take in the module, is understanding the complexities around different behaviours and consequences, and really trying to tease apart cause and effect. And one of the things we cover is trying to distinguish understanding how something exists. So those are things like ontogeny and mechanism. And at the same time, why does that exist in the first place, which overlaps a lot more with kind of evolutionary history and that kind of, more broader context around it. And we try to match that all together in the course.
All right. Thank you. And we also discussed so people who take care of children in the child rearing process, and mothers, fathers, grandmothers as well. Can we really consider mothers and fathers as universal caregivers?
So it again probably depends on how you define universality, right? Because you certainly have lots of people who grow up without mums or without dads, and they thrive and they do really, really well. But what we know is that maternal caregiving tends to be the dominant form, I guess, across different cultures. But actually the amount and how mums would care for children vary quite a lot in different contexts. And a similar thing with fathers, I guess. So fathering exists as a facultative trait in humans, which means that it exists as a behavior among humans, but actually not all fathers provide care. So what that really kind of shows us is that how we care and how much care we provide to children and who cares and, how it all works is very, very context dependent to some extent. Of course, there are certain things that are shared between cultures, particularly things like babies need care, right? So that's a fundamental thing. Babies are born relatively helpless, they can't feed themselves, they can't move, which is quite unusual compared to other mammals. So it means that human children require lots and lots of care so that they can survive and thrive, but who provides that care and how much of that is provided tends to vary across different within and between cultures.
Do you have an example of a context where mothers and fathers aren't necessarily the primary caregivers, and that your students usually react to quite strongly or are quite surprised by?
Yeah, I think I often like to talk about like egalitarian hunter-gatherer populations, because I think how caregiving is observed in that context can be quite different to what we are used to in developed populations, or at least from my experience growing up in Japan and England, and how caregiving existed while I was growing up. Because in forager population or hunter-gatherer populations, caregiving is a lot more widely shared. So it depends again on different forager populations, because obviously their environments vary a lot as well. But you can have multiple caregivers, so lots of different people can hold babies. So you don't necessarily observe mums being the predominant or exclusive caregiver. You would see like children holding babies. You would see people just passing babies around. And once babies are weaned, so once normally between 2 to 4 years old, and they're not being breastfed anymore, then actually they get a lot of independence. So in lots of different hunter-gatherer populations, you would observe like groups of children kind of hanging out with each other and kind of playing and looking after each other. So you don't really have this, I guess, what we might be used to in developed populations, where you have this quite structured nuclear family norms where you have mum and dad looking after children. Actually, it's a lot more collectively shared with lots of different people. And that can mean, for example, where there is father absence, actually it might not have a necessarily negative impact on children's developmental outcomes, because other people are able to kind of chip in and substitute that care in a way. And there's, it depends on studies, but you might have similar finding with mums. But with mums, they tend to be very, very important in the first few years of life, particularly during breastfeeding and infant feeding in that time. So mothers are more difficult to substitute, although it is possible, right? Because we know lots of kind of anecdotal reports of other people feeding babies, and there's adoption and things like that.
Right, okay, thank you. During the course, we also discussed intensive mothering and how that has arguably become an expectation for mothers in developed countries. Could you explain what intensive mothering is and why we should be aware of that concept?
Sure. So intensive mothering, I would describe it as, I guess, as a culture where there's both an expectation, but also the desire for mothers to invest extremely heavily into children in terms of direct caregiving. So it's kind of that close contact, very expensive form of childcare to children. So you might be observing them quite substantially. You might be kind of trying to create environments around your child so that they develop optimally. So you might, buy toys where it's, so one of the examples in my course I showed was a baby Einstein toy, I guess, for like 6 months old. It's about trying to create this optimal environment for child rearing, but the responsibility predominantly falls on the mother to be able to create that kind of perfect environment for children. And what happens is that leads to a lot of pressure around mothers being almost the kind of sole caregiver or the person with the main responsibility on the well-being of children. So even in things where actually mums might have very little impact on children's developmental outcomes, or some random events can happen, then it's associated, or it's kind of internalized as, it's mothers are primarily responsible, therefore it would be their fault if anything goes wrong. So it kind of leads to, I would argue, it probably leads to overinvestment into children in the way that could potentially be even detrimental, particularly for women's well-being, but also if it leads to things like helicopter parenting, which is kind of hovering over your child and not letting them have autonomy to decide things, make mistakes and things like that, that could potentially also lead to negative outcomes for children's developmental outcomes as well. So I think it's, so if I kind of summarize it, I guess intensive mothering is where, you know, the entirety of responsibility of looking after children falls on the shoulders of women, when in fact across cultures that's quite unusual. So caregiving is usually shared within and between families, but you know, so there's this kind of mismatch of what works in looking after children, which is to share the care and, you know, share responsibilities, but then there's this cultural expectation that mothers are expected to invest intensively into their children.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting part of the course. To finish off, who do you think should take this course and why?
I wanted to create a course where we really explored variation in child rearing practices, but also get deep into it and try to explore, you know, why things happened, how things happened, and get to that nitty-gritty detail. So in that sense, if you're interested in understanding variation in human behavior, that might be of interest for some students.
I think this is much more than just a class on child rearing, which is the title, but I think it's also, it really helps you reflect on different ways of raising children, because if you live in England or if you live in Europe, I think people tend to make generalizations about how to raise your children, what's the best way to do that, and there's been a lot of debate, especially politically as well, on that. So I think it's important to put it all in perspective.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, I guess. One of the things I really like about the course and the tutorials and talking to students is kind of, you know, when people share their experiences or what they think is normal, and then students are talking to each other and they realize that what they experience, you know, it's not, I think the really important thing is, I'm clear from the outset in the course, is that, you know, there's no perfect family structure, and there's lots of variation. So whatever, you know, people experience lots of different things around child rearing, or how, you know, who looks after them, and then people start sharing their stories, and that's quite interesting for me to eavesdrop and listen to, actually, and be like, oh, that's really interesting that this person grew up here, and that's the kind of you know, that's the kind of culture they grew up in, and I guess there's lots of kind of knowledge sharing that happens quite organically, which is quite fun for me anyway.
Yeah, I would really encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about, I mean, this is anthropology in general, but of learning more about other ways to do things in general. I would really recommend taking this course. So thanks a lot for answering all my questions, and